Hey guys, this is William with a bit of a different video for Play-agricola.com's YouTube channel and twitch.tv/play_agricola. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the card Educator today. Just to give you a bit of an overview, we're going to go over when do you want to play the Educator, how do you use it, what are good ways of paying for the Educator, some occupations that work well with it, and minors that work well with it. And we're also going to go over some common play patterns, how you want to navigate playing Educator. So the text on Educator says whenever another player, not literally, says whenever another player plays an occupation, pay 3 food to play an occupation if it's your second or third. Otherwise, pay 2 food to play an occupation. I'm going to assume that in most cases your Educator is going to be your first played occupation, although that's not always going to be the case. When do you want to play the Educator? When you have powerful minors with high occupation prerequisites. The Educator is a card that lets you get multiple occupations out faster than normal. Cards which pay off for getting to high occupation counts can be very strong. Cards when you have really good feeding support, so if you have occupations which help you feed particularly well, those are often good to play with the Educator because this game's all about setting up engines. The faster you can set up your feeding support engine, the faster it starts paying off for you. And if you have a lot of, in general, if Educator's worth playing if you have a lot of good occupations. It's worth trying to craft a game where you can play Educator if your occupations are strong. And so long as they have relatively loose timing requirements. If you have 4 occupations that all need to get played in stage 1 and none of your occupations help with feeding, that's not a great Educator hand. But if you have Educator and maybe 1 occupation that wants to get played in stage 1, you got a couple Occs that help get you food, and then a couple Occs that give you various benefits throughout the game, with no firm timing requirements, that's the kind of hand that loves having Educator in it. The other factor is the card quality. So if you are doing deal 7 in EIK, the odds that you have more than 4 occupations you want to play are very low, including the Educator. Now, if you're playing a draft 9, of course, your occupation quality goes up immensely. Very often with draft 9, you want to play 5 occupations for a winning farm, 4 or 5 occupations. And if you're doing 10-3, you know, what decks are you playing with? Are you playing with G4-5, which is a stronger overall than EIK? Are you playing, you know, crazy playtest cards, which are usually extremely strong? Has your group filtered out some of the strongest and the weakest occupations and minors? Like that's going to affect the card quality. Yeah, so all those factor into how strong the Educator is. So when should you play Educator? Usually it should be your first occupation played, and the only exception that I can think of off the top of my head might be Patron, depending on your seating order. Things to remember is that occupations come out very reliably in stage 1. Often the occupation spaces are some of the best actions in round 1 and 2 because there are just not that many options for your opponents to take generally. So because they come out reliably early, that's really good times for you to plan around your opponents playing occupations. Yeah, later in the game, they are a lot more sporadic. It's a lot more, without knowing exactly what's in your opponent's hands, it's more difficult to predict when they're going to be playing occupations. So that's why you generally want to play Educator early. Another thing to consider is, are you going to do some Occs shenanigans? Now, if you have a card like Occs, or Occs Collector, maybe it's worth delaying Educator for that. But in general, you want to be playing the Educator early. And lastly, guys, I just want to add that another option of how you can use the Educator is to compare it to the 1 food occupation space. So if you're playing 3 food for an occupation and you use day labor to pay for it, that means you've net spent 1 food for the occupation and you've used 1 action. Well, that's the equivalent of going on the 1 food occupation space, except that instead of using your first action to go on the 1 food occupation space, you've used a very late action like day labor in order to pay for the occupation. That means your first action can use a better quality action, for example, 3 wood or read stone food. So educator is an occupation that lets you play occupations. So the educator has to do something to justify its existence, because if the educator is an Occ that lets you play Occs, well, if you have only one other Occ to play, you should just play that other Occ. You don't need to play the educator. And so if we look at that, if you just play an Occ normally, it would cost 1 action and some amount of food, somewhere between 0 and 1 for your first occupation. And in stage 1, the ways that you get food, the way that you value food is very common. It's pretty common to be able to get 1 food. For example, on the Reedstone food space, usually 2 food actions are quite bad. So you sometimes will see people take fishing and traveling players at 3 food, and maybe you take 2 sheep or fishing or traveling players when they're worth 4 food. That's more rare and requires more of a setup generally, but pretty reliably you can get 3 food as an action in round 3. And I just added a note there. Day labor is usually a bad action. You should try to avoid it. So if you're playing educator and then taking day labor 3 times in stage 1, that's not usually going to pay off well for you. And we'll just quickly look at what are the values of an action. So playing occupations are good. You know, your free occupation is very often the best action in round 1. It's up there with Reedstone food. And a little behind that is 3 wood, and 3 wood is kind of close with the expensive occupation space. And usually 2 wood and 2 clay are fine options. Start player, of course, can go up and down depending on what miners you have in your hand. And then lastly, you'll sometimes see people take field or day labor or even grain, but grain's pretty rare. So this is a bit of a breakdown of the costs. So we're looking at the food costs and then the action costs of playing occupations with and without educator. So I'd like to highlight this this column when I say number of occupations. For a hand with educator in it, I'm actually not counting the educator as an occupation. The reason being that the educator does nothing for your farm on its own. It doesn't give you food, it doesn't give you points, it doesn't help you do anything. All the educator does is let you play other occupations. So when we look at how good the educator is on low occupation counts, we have to not count the educator as an occupation. So if you're only going to play 1 occupation, if you play it without the educator, it's usually going to cost you 0 food. But if you play the educator first and then play your 1 occupation, that costs you 3 food. And of course, that's a difference of 3 food. So, and you've spent the same number of actions. So spending the same number of actions, but then spending 3 more food, that's bad. Especially in stage 1, you're not usually, an action is usually 3 food or sometimes less, depending on what you're going to do. So it would have just been better for you not to play the educator, just play your action, your occupation normally. Then we can see at 2 occupations, again, the food difference is at 5, and that's 2 actions. You've saved 1 action, but you've spent 5 extra food. How often is 1 action worth 5 food? That's pretty rare. And then we go, as we get further down the table, 4, 5, 6 played occupations, not including the educator, of course, that's where we really start to see the benefit, because now, you're spending 7 extra food, but you're saving 3 actions. Now, can you get 7 food with 3 actions? Absolutely. Can you get it in stage 1? Not always, but if you've built a cooking hearth, taking vegetable 3 times is better than 7 food. Or taking cattle 3 times is better than 7 food if you have a cooking hearth, even if you only have a fireplace. And then once we get deeper, obviously the difference is getting bigger, but the number of actions that we're saving is getting a lot bigger. And obviously, an ideal educator hand plays all 6 of its other occupations. You've spent 9 extra food compared to the cost of just playing those occupations 1 at a time on the occupation space, but you've saved yourself 5 actions in the process. So can you get 9 food with 5 actions? You can day labor 5 times to get better than 9 food. And I've said already, day labor is a bad action. You can get better than 9. You can get much better than 2 food per action. So what are some of the cards that work well with the educator? So the first one is Dancer, and this is the most straightforward and probably the easiest to understand why. What the Dancer does is it says you always have a 4 food action available, so long as nobody else has taken traveling players. Why is that relevant for the educator? Well, for the educator to play most often the third occupation, you need to get a 3 food action. And ideally, you would like something even better than a 3 food action. So Dancer is a card giving you 4 food. So 3 of that food can go towards the educator occupation. And then you've also come out 1 action ahead. If we compare that to playing an occupation normally, where you would have had to spend a food and an action, the Dancer is putting you, instead of down food, the educator Dancer combo is actually gaining you food as you play these occupations. Another example of this is Farm Worker. Now this card doesn't directly put food onto the plow space, but what it does is it lets you get other building resources, and then it basically says when you plow, if you have educator in play, you can, turn a building resource, I shouldn't say if you have educator in play, but when you plow, you get 3 food, and that 3 food pays for an educator occupation. And again, if we compare that to just playing an occupation normally, you don't get a field out of it. And even if it's food neutral, you've gained a field, which is 2 points. So that's an example where, educator is fantastic, because instead of going on the occupation space a bunch of times, you can go on the plow and field space and develop your farm. Another example, another kind of category is cards that give food from occupations. These sort of seem pretty obvious because, a card like Patron, in the future, whenever you play an Occ, you get 2 food before you pay the costs. Well, that plus educator, obviously the Patron is going to help you pay for your occupations. Another example of this is Village Druid. It's more indirect, of course, because you get a sheep and you need to have some way of eating those sheep. For example, building the 2 clay fireplace. Another example from the NL deck, a minor improvement bookcase. So whenever you play an occupation, you get a vegetable. If you have a cooking hearth, that's getting you 3 food, maybe even better than more food than even the Patron and the Village Druid. Another example of cards that work well with educator are cards that give immediate food. So the most obvious example of this is Borrower. When you play Borrower, you get 7 food. Now, even let's say Borrower is your second played occupation after educator. So you had to pay 3 food to pay for the Borrower, but then you've come out 4 food ahead. So you've not spent an action to gain plus 4 food. That 4 food can go towards your 3rd and your 4th and your 5th occupations. And in general, it just gives you great tempo on accelerating your game. Just very quickly, Borrower is good because 6 food in round 1 in stage 1 is worth a lot more than 6 food in round 14. Another example of this is Hasty Trader. So the ability to turn building resources into food lets you, you can play Hasty Trader, use Educator to play Hasty Trader, which can give you more food to play more occupations, or maybe you play Hasty Trader in the round before a harvest, and then you get to use the Hasty Trader to feed for your harvest, and you haven't used an action to settle your feeding. Another example is Miller, and Miller is a less obvious one. But what Miller does is it lets you build a baking improvement when you play the occupation. So if you have anything to bake with, i.e. a grain, you can play Miller using the Educator, and then you build the clay oven, and then you bake that 1 grain into 5 food. And you've come out, without using an action, you've gained 3 food, or 2 or 3 food, depending on how much you paid for Miller, and you've also built the clay oven, which is a thing that you want to do generally. Another good, other good combos. In general, Agricola is a game where An edge that you can have is you can see what your opponents want to do and predict what they want to do. Educator is a card that kind of disrupts your opponent's ability to do that. And some examples, a card like Frame Builder. So if you're on a 3 clay house and your opponents don't know about Frame Builder, they might behave as if you can't build a room. But then, you know, player B doesn't take start player when they need to. They maybe greedily take a 4 wood action or something. Player C plays an occupation. You've got Educator in play. You use your Educator to play Frame Builder, which is functionally like a 2 clay action for you. Then you go on the build a room space, and maybe you've jumped player B in the family growth queue. Another example of this is Blacksmith. So when you play Blacksmith, you get to build a major improvement. And so something that you can do, which is kind of nice, is maybe an opponent of yours sets up to build the well when you have 2 stone. Then the player after them maybe plays an occupation. You use your Educator to play Blacksmith. Blacksmith then can build the well because, of course, you can discount by a stone cost. And then maybe even you snap up the clay oven on your turn. And you've got 2 miners off the board before the first player who got up to, or 2 majors off the board before the first player who got up to the 3 stone can react. And another example of this from the B deck 2016 edition is Roof Baluster. So pay food to get a stone for each room. Very often, at the end of the game, the number of renos becomes limiting. And if you can go, like say you start play around 13 to going into round 14 and 2 other players can reno, well, someone plays an occupation, all of a sudden you're now ready to renovate you're now able to renovate to a stone house. And then with your first action, you can reno fence, for example, unexpectedly. That forces the next player who can reno to reno themselves. And then, you know, you've disrupted what people thought was going to happen. And usually when you disrupt what your opponents want to do, you will benefit off of that. Good miners, the tried and true one is Animal Pen. So Animal Pen, of course, has a 4 occupation prerequisite. In the right setup, Animal Pen is a good miner if you can play it in round 6. If you can get 2 food before the round 7 harvest, usually Animal Pen is going to be quite good for you. Now, Educator can do silly stuff like play Animal Pen in round 2. It's not often, but if you have Borrower and a 4 wood occupation in your hand, you can play a round 2 Animal Pen. That gets you 4 food before the first harvest, which is all 4 of the food for your family, not to mention 6 food before the second harvest for you know, going the rest of the way. Animal Pen is a fantastic miner with Educator. Animal Pen's one of those cards that the earlier you get it out, the better, and Educator is a card that helps you get it out earlier. And it's also nice because Educator spends food to get actions, while Animal Pen gets you a lot of food. So then it helps replenish you. Another example is Quarry. So Quarry is often a card that you like. It's got a free 2 points on it, but the action of getting 3 stone from day labor is not always very relevant, because sometimes you get pretty deep into the game before you have 4 occupations in play, and then you need a minor improvement action, and then you need to day labor, and then you need to play a major. Like that's a lot, or reno or whatever. That's a lot of actions. A card like Educator, similar to Animal Pen, can get you the Quarry out, say, in round 5. Well, very often in round 5, no one's going to have 3 stone yet. So if you can play the Quarry in round 5 with support from the Educator, that means you have a 2 food and 3 stone action, which is way more stone than anyone else in the game has access to. Gives you first shot at building the well, first shot at building the stone oven, pottery, all the really good major improvements. And another example of a great miner that works with Educator, miners that give you food. A card like Credit is fantastic. You get 5 food right away. That can pay for 2 occupations, and then you pay the food back later, which is no problem. So like you can use Credit stay on family growth in round 5 or round 6. That food can either pay for your next harvest, or it could help you pay for 2 occupations, which maybe you set up your feeding engine in round 7, and then you're good to go for the rest of the way. We're going to look at just a couple common play patterns here. So I think what I think is the ideal situation for educator, we'll just go over here. Starting second in round 1 is in a 4-player game is the best seat. So we've started the game. We're in round 1. We're the blue player. We've used our first action to play educator. At the end of this turn, we have 3 food in our supply, an educator in play. We're ready to play an occupation when one of our opponents plays an occupation. And then we're going to look and we can see the 4th player played an occupation. Now this is where we want to play our food setup card, our food engine, whatever's going to help us play more occupations. And we play dancer. So dancer is a fantastic card. I already talked about it, 4 food from traveling players. I've gotten dancer out. And then we go to our second action in round 1 and we just go on the traveling players, get 4 food out of it. And now that's enough food for another occupation in the following round. And we can keep continuing to play our occupations. So then we can look and we can see now at the start of round 2, maybe we've taken 4 wood or 3 wood and the player after us has taken a cheap occupation. Well, now we're in a fantastic spot where we're ready to pay 3 food for an occupation and then go back to the traveling player's spot with our second move. This is a different game here. So let's suppose that we're going into, let's suppose in round 1 we started 3rd or 4th. And by the time it got to our first action, both of the occupation spaces were gone. Well, we did 3 wood and then we took day labor for our 2 actions. So we had not a great round 1, but fine. And then we've gone into round 2 and the players in front of us have all left the cheap occupation space open. Awesome of them to do that. So we go ahead and we play our free educator. And then let's say our opponents all say, hey, you played educator. We don't want to feed your educator, so we're going to avoid playing occupations. They've done stuff like take 2 clay, 2 wood, and playing on start player. Well, this is a case where this is like a bit of a common pitfall, and I'm going to get more into this later, but people will often think they can only play occupations with the educator. If your opponents give you last action round 2 occupation for 1 food, that is a good action. That is often better than most of the actions they will have taken. I would rather pay 1 food for an occupation than take 2 clay in round 2, for example. So this is a case where we just say, thank you very much. We're going to play on expensive occupation. And in this example, we played tile maker. And we still have food to play an occupation in round 3 in response. Maybe we decide that we're going to use the tile maker clay to build a fireplace and then grab sheep. Or maybe we use the clay, we try to get on reedstone food grain and build the clay oven. We have a lot of options from this position. So I've talked a lot about the drawbacks of Educator, but I want to emphasize that it is a fantastic card. And what are some of the ways that you can play around it? In general, I think Agricola is a game where you play around it by doing what's best for you. If you have a great game, then that kind of, if you have a great move, generally that should take priority over everything. But you should generally try to be aware of when your opponents will play occupations. And in particular, you're trying to be wary of sneaky plays. For example, if you have the option of being greedy and hopefully not building a room until the next round, so that maybe you save on a start player action or something. Well, if your opponent's played Educator, you have to be aware of, well, are the people between me and the Educator likely to play occupations? Because if they do, the Educator can play an occupation and then build a room which you won't have time to respond to, for example. You should also keep track of the Educator's food. So often the Educator can't play multiple consecutive occupations, especially not early in the game. Unless they've really got some kind of engine, they often cannot play multiple consecutive occupations. So once they've played Educator and played an occupation that doesn't give food in round 1 or round 2, you've got the green light to play an occupation, because often they won't even have 3 food on their board, 3 or 2 food, depending on how many played occupations they're at. Some common pitfalls. People play Educator, they try to play too many occupations too quickly. So what I want to emphasize here is that two food actions are bad. So if you're going to play an occupation, but then you're going to have to take day labor afterwards, or you're going to take day labor in anticipation of playing an occupation, that's not what you want to be doing. You want to be taking more than two food. You want to be taking three, ideally four food as much as possible. If you can get the first sheep grab, so say you do a 3 food action in round 3, you've played a couple occupations with Educator, then you set yourself up to grab the first sheep grab at 3 sheep in round 4. That's enough to feed for your first harvest, and then another 2 food for another occupation. Another example is tapping out on food, so putting yourself in a position where you can't respond to what your opponents are doing. So you don't want to spend too much time as the Educator with 0 food, because one of the powers of the Educator is that you can respond to what your opponents can do, and there's a threat of activation. If your opponents know you have a 4-wood occupation, then they have to respect that. They have to respect the fact that you could play that 4-wood occupation and then build a room immediately, for example. However, if you're going into round 4 and you don't take food, and there's not enough food for you to build a room and play an occupation, for example, that's an example where your opponents don't have to be afraid of that 4-wood action anymore. They know that you don't have the food to support it. Another common pitfall, and this is just a generic pitfall with anyone who plays Agricola, you need to set up a food engine. You cannot spend an extra 2 food per harvest. Like, feeding your family per harvest is hard enough in this game as it is. And Educator is saying, hey, pay an extra 2 food and I'll give you an action. Well, that's great, but you have to be able to afford the 2 food. So you need to set up some kind of food engine. It could be as simple as playing a cooking hearth and making sure you take 2 boar, 2 cattle when they're available. And that can be fine. That's usually good enough. But you really need something, and ideally, when you play Educator, you're either gonna, if you're drafting, you're either picking occupations very highly that help you feed, or you're making sure that you, or if you're not drafting, you're trying to, you might consider not playing Educator if, say, you only have 2 or 3 really good other occupations and none of them help you get food. Other thing to look out for is nombos. So for example, cards that refer to the occupation action space, cards that activate when you go on the occupation action space, they don't work when you play a card with Educator. So some cards to avoid. Number 1 for me is Private Forest. So Private Forest is a bit of an unusual card in that you usually want to be playing it at round 1 on start player, but it costs you 2 food. So what Private Forest does is it makes it very difficult to play more than 1 or 2 occupations in stage 1 under normal circumstances. Playing more than 1 or 2 occupations with Educator after having played Private Forest is basically impossible, because you're using that 2 food that you would use for your first occupation instead on they're playing the Private Forest. Another example is cards that have high food requirements. So an example is Grotto from the France deck. So Grotto, you want to be paying 2 food each round to clear a resource off the Grotto, because once it's cleared, you have room for a family member. So it's sort of like you're building a room with food and getting clay and stone in the meanwhile. Now the Educator, if you're spending 2 food to play an occupation, 2 or 3 food, it's very unlikely that you're also going to have 2 food to spend on the Grotto, because there's just not that much food in the game, and it's very difficult for you to get that much food in total each round. Another example is cards like A-Deck Freshman. So Freshman, whenever you get a bake bread action, instead of baking, you can play an occupation. Well, it's redundant, right? That seems pretty obvious. You don't want to use Freshman to play Educator. You don't want to use Educator to play Freshman. Those are cards that you don't want to have in the same hand. And then lastly, another example is Head of the Family. So the reason I highlight Head of the Family here is because usually when you have Head of the Family, you want to set up for building a room, building multiple rooms as early as you can, so that you can take advantage of the fact that you can unblockably family growth. And that unblockably family growth is extremely strong. And the problem that the educator has is that usually when you are playing educator, you're going to be using your food instead of feeding a big family. Head of the family makes a nice big family, while if the educator is spending a whole bunch of food to play occupations, well, then you're not going to also be able to feed. If you've grown to 4 people in round 7, it's going to be very difficult for you to feed 7 food and also have played a bunch of occupations with the educator. Another thing I want to mention about head of the family is just that if you do have educator and you have early game feeding cards and you have cards that can help build rooms, well, then educator and head of the family could work really well together. However, most of the time when you play head of the family, you don't want to be playing 3 occupations before it. You want usually head of the family to be your second or your third occupation to keep your food costs down, so that most of your early actions can go towards setting up, building a room, and family growthing. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little video. If you could, I'd really like to hear what you think. So if you could give me some feedback in the comments section below. This is a thank you we've got to 300 subscribers on YouTube, and I've had 10 active subs on Twitch, which is awesome. Really been enjoying making the content. Hopefully you guys are enjoying watching it. If you've not already subscribed or followed to me, I play Agricola almost daily on Play-agricola.com. I do mostly pretty much entirely 4-player games. I do like playing with unpublished decks, so that sometimes takes a little bit of getting used to. But there's also some playlists on the channel with published decks only. And we're also doing some play testing for new decks that will come out that expand on the A, B, C, D format. So if you have the new 2016 edition, we're actually in the process of play testing cards that will come out that are designed to play with that edition as well. You can see the J4 playtest tournament on the channel. And that's all for me. We'll see you guys next time.